Assalamu alaikum and a belated Eid Mubarak to all of our guests who are joining us today. I want to welcome you all to Pacifica Institute's online talk series. My name is Fitnat Mutlu. I will be the moderator for today's program. Today's event topic is Contemporary Issues in the Humanity of Muhammad, peace be upon him. And our guest is Dr. Craig Considine. Dr. Craig is a scholar, global speaker, media contributor, and public intellectual based at the Department of Sociology at Rice University. He is the author of many books and articles. Dr. Craig's opinions have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, BBC, CBS News, Fox News, MSNBC, Newsweek, and Foreign Policy. He has been invited to speak at some of the leading international organizations and universities in the world. Dr. Craig is visible on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. He holds a PhD from Trinity College, University of Dublin, an MSc from Royal Holloway, University of London, and a BA from American University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Craig is a U.S. Catholic of Irish and Italian descent. Hello, Dr. Craig, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Fitnat. Thank you so much for that precise introduction, and it's very nice to meet you. I hope all is well in Ohio.
Yes, it is good. Alhamdulillah. Thank you. The floor is all yours for our discussion, again, about contemporary issues in the humanity of Muhammad.
Great. Thank you so much, Fitnat. Thank you, everyone, for joining this session today. I hope this finds you well. Peace be with each and every single one of you. And for the Muslims who are watching, I hope Ramadan was a spiritually uplifting and enriching time for you and your family. I think some of you may know that at the beginning of Ramadan, I did post something on my own tradition with fasting, and fasting from a Christian perspective, it's kind of an under-researched area, and I actually fast quite often. So I hope the holy month for you was spiritually uplifting. So today I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for hopefully a lively Q&A. And as Fitnat mentioned, the topic today is contemporary issues and the humanity of Muhammad. And the talk is really motivated by some of the research that I've been carrying out largely since 2003 or 4, when I was a young man at American University in Washington, D.C. And I came to the Islamic tradition largely as an individual that had interest in understanding why something like 9/11 happened, because I was a young man, 16 years old when 9/11 happened, and I was living in the suburbs of Boston, and I had absolutely no context for something like 9/11. I never met a Muslim. I didn't know really anything about traditional Islam or Islamic history because we really didn't learn about them in school. So I kind of went into this large realm of even religion and Christian-Muslim relations and Islam with a slightly kind of negative connotation, if I could call it that, kind of through this prism of 9/11 and violence and the clash of civilizations. And a long story short, I had some incredible teachers when I was at American University, and these professors who were from a variety of backgrounds, but the main one that had a specific impact on me was Professor Akbar Ahmed of American University, a prominent anthropologist who really blessed me with multiple opportunities to travel with him and to study with him. And in essence, I came to learn quite quickly that this Islamic tradition is rich. It's rich in history. It's rich in its theological connections to Christianity, my own faith. And of course, I've always been interested in history. And when I started learning that history is a lot bigger than the United States and so-called Western civilization, I became fascinated. And it wasn't until about 2013 when I came into contact with the Covenants of Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of his time, which is a book. Literally, that's the title of the book. The Covenants of Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of his time by John Andrew Morrow. And prior to getting kind of my physical hands on this book, I really didn't know much about Muhammad. I had largely been studying kind of Islam broadly speaking and trying to figure out, why something like 9/11 happened, but also why the clash of civilizations, exists in the first place. So it was through the covenants that I really kind of got introduced to Muhammad. And this was when I was a PhD student at Trinity College. And I started writing about his life and legacy, studying more and more, and, really became inspired, intrigued, interested, not only from an academic perspective in terms of his life, but also what a prominent person like himself can do for communities. I started seeing Muhammad as someone that actually could bring communities together, which isn't obvious to a lot of people. For some people, Muhammad is a source of division, especially for Christians, because of historical, theology and all this stuff. So the more I dug into his life, the more I started realizing that his life and legacy and his teachings and the stories we know about him can actually bridge the gap between the so-called Western civilization and Islamic civilization. And the more I studied his life, the more I started realizing that some of the things that make this country tick, the United States, were also things that were found in the early Ummah, when Muhammad was devising his society, his nation, and when he was receiving revelations. So then at that point, the world for me got really small. I started seeing humanity. I started seeing that people from different moments in history, from different walks of life, from different parts of the world, are actually thinking, behaving, philosophizing in the same way as people 300, 600, 900, whatever many years after the fact. So to say that, I was intrigued by him is maybe an understatement. And I'm sure for those who are watching now, you'll know that I do spend a lot of my social media energy to the life and legacy of Muhammad because I'm reading about him and I'm writing about him. And this brings us to kind of why we're here today, The Humanity of Muhammad, which is a book that is coming out hopefully within a week, but things are a bit messy at the moment with Amazon and deliveries. And I was hoping to get through a talk without saying coronavirus, but there we go. Hopefully that's the only time I'll say it. But this book, The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View, is essentially a slight biography of my life, at least the first chapter. And then it gets into some sociological themes and some theological issues that have inspired me. But let me actually go back a little bit, because the Humanity of Muhammad, this book, which is being published by Blue Dome Press in New Jersey, Hakan Yassiyova was a fantastic editor and publisher. It actually stems from this book, and I hope you can see that. It's called Muhammad Nabi Cinta, and that essentially means the prophet of love. And I was asked to write this book for Noura Books in Indonesia, and it came out years ago, and I didn't have an English version. So I wanted to provide this piece of scholarship to an English-speaking audience, and thankfully, Blue Dome Press came into the picture, and we drastically transformed the book, really. This book is written in Indonesian. It's actually not a translation. The Blue Dome Press book is not a translation. It's significantly different because when we started working on it. So that's kind of the history of my own kind of interest into this field, and then also why we're here, this book. So the book is a sociological / theological overview and insight into some themes that we see playing out today in the present context. And I use stories from Muhammad's life, largely his interactions with Christians or Jews or people of different races and ethnicities. And I kind of shed light on it in a way that makes sense to people today. So I try to use words, which we'll go over in a little bit, like, racial equality or religious tolerance or integration. These are kind of buzzwords in a way, at least in the realm of sociology, and to be fair, in the media that we see popping up. And again, it goes back to this clash of civilizations idea, like this idea that, oh, Muslims don't integrate or Muslims aren't tolerant, and kind of all these stereotypes that just really aren't true. So the book dispels these stereotypes and these misperceptions. So I'll share with you some of the themes of the book. Let's see how much kind of time we have here. But there are 7 themes, and I think we'll get through certainly this concept of religious pluralism, anti-racism, and the notion of a civic nation. So these are 3 sociological concepts. And again, I'm using Muhammad's life and legacy to shed contemporary light on this issue. So religious pluralism. Before we dive into Muhammad's life, let's look and consider what religious pluralism is. So first, we must distinguish religious pluralism from religious tolerance. This is what Diana Eck, a scholar at Harvard University of the Pluralism Project, has done. She's kind of said that pluralism is not tolerance. In doing so, she's not saying tolerance isn't good. It's just that tolerance doesn't go far enough to build proper bridges of understanding. So she further breaks pluralism down by saying diversity alone is not, it's not something that necessarily should be, let's say, celebrated, or people shouldn't be content with merely living in a diverse society. Eck is saying that pluralism is the energetic engagement with diversity. So she's telling people to enter dialogue, to educate one another, to understand one another, to commit and to work with one another, and to engage with one another. So it's active. That's what pluralism is. And tolerance, if you think about it, what tolerance is, when you tolerate a behavior of a sibling or a child, if you're a parent, you know, there's something kind of standoffish about it, or it's something that you kind of turn your cheek to or turn your eye to, and you kind of forget. So Eck is saying that it's a process, and it takes energy, and it takes effort, and it takes commitment. And if we look at Muhammad's life, I think I'll use just one example today, but there are many instances in which we see him going beyond mere religious tolerance. I think fundamentally, if you look at a book like the Quran, the Islamic holy text, I mean, it's fundamentally tolerant, especially of Jews and Christians. We know that there's a special place for monotheists in the Quran. They're al-Kitab, people of the book, and that they were given scripture that was authentic, and then over time, you know, interpretation things happen, and people lose their message. But you know, the Quran, I think, in essence, is pluralistic in a theological sense. But it's Muhammad who is actually giving the example of where going beyond tolerance comes in. So if we kind of go towards the end of his life in the year 630, we are told through various early Islamic historians and even some secular texts that Muhammad was kind of rising in power, and he was thinking about communicating his message and his vision for the Ummah, or the nation, to the neighbors around Arabia and the world. And he was sending, you know, telegrams, or the modern form is like an email, basically saying, hey, here I am. This is who I am. This is what I believe in. And he sent one to the Christians of Najran. And he sent many. I mean, we have multiple covenants, which is bringing me back to John Andrew Morrow. But there's one instance in which he sends this official document to the Christians of Najran, which is on modern day Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the border in the south. And back then it was a broader region, and Christianity had been in Najran for centuries. Some say even perhaps as early as the 2nd century, which would be 400 years. And at first, when the Christians of Najran received Muhammad's official diplomatic correspondence, they probably, well, the sources say that they were probably thinking, like, who is this person who's saying, like, he's a prophet after Jesus? That can't be possible. And the Christians of Najran, were told, did not respond favorably to his initial request for them to visit Medina. But then the Christians of Najran, not being stubborn and understanding that people wanted to talk to them, other monotheists actually, the delegation of the Christians of Najran go north. And you can imagine on a trade caravan through the Hijaz coming up to Medina and seeing Masjid al-Nabawi, like a new center of people claiming that they were monotheists. And Muhammad welcomes them into his masjid. And to me, that very invitation would be more than tolerance. Like welcoming someone into the mosque or any place of worship is an act of hospitality. Tolerance would be like greeting someone at the door and saying, "Hey, it's nice to meet you. We like you, but see you later," if you get what I'm saying, in a very kind of practical way. So again, the Islamic historians are telling us that inside the masjid, Muhammad and the Christians of Najran, there was apparently like 60 or so. There was a bishop, there were other kind of politicians, and essentially the believers, Muhammad and the Christians of Najran, engage in a dialogue. And we're told, again, through the sources, that Jesus, or the Christology, the relationship between Jesus's divine and human nature, came up. And in essence, they agreed to disagree. Obviously, Muhammad was not saying that Jesus is divine. The Christians were saying he's the Son of God, but they agreed to disagree. That's tolerance, which is excellent, and that's needed. That's why earlier I said tolerance is not a bad thing. But the beauty and the pluralism again comes in when it's time for the Christians of Najran to engage in their prayer. And as they were leaving, we are told that Muhammad kind of calls them back in, and you can imagine him saying, you're already in a house of God. It's dirty outside. It's not suitable for you to engage in prayer. You can just use our space. It doesn't contradict our fundamental beliefs. We're just being hospitable. And they did that. They accepted the invitation. And there are some sources that actually tell us that Muhammad even let some Christian symbols actually hang up. But that's a story for another day inside the masjid. So again, to me, that is the distinguishing feature between pluralism and tolerance. It's the energy of like welcoming people in, being open, and just being hospitable. I think there's a unique difference there with pluralism, and I'm very thankful that episode in history happened. I'm not only thankful that Muhammad behaved the way he did, but I'm also happy that the Christians accepted the invitation. It takes, as they say, it kind of takes two to tango. And in this instance, we had two communities rightly guided coming together in a civil manner, and ultimately one that built a bridge, because we're also told that the Christians of Najran left Medina with essentially a covenant and an agreement. And they basically said, we accept Muhammad's rule. We believe in him. So it's really powerful. And we look at that in a contemporary context. I think we really need to be critical of this idea of religious tolerance and even interfaith dialogue. Like just because you have an interfaith dialogue session or you're engaged in interfaith dialogue doesn't necessarily mean that you're energetically engaging with that diversity. So I think, tolerance is a virtue and it's necessary, but if we really want to get to know one another and if we really want to build strong bridges, tolerance is not enough. That's what Eck was saying, and arguably that's what Muhammad was saying. So the second feature, let's move to racial equality. I mean, you can't pick a more timely topic with what's happening in this country, the United States, especially right now. It feels, unfortunately, that we're so far away from a racially equal society, or what some people might want to say, post-racial, where race just goes away and it doesn't become a factor anymore. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like we're close to that. And what I've argued in my research and what I argue in the Humanity of Muhammad, a Christian View, is that Muhammad was actually very explicit when it came to racial equality, much more so than Jesus, actually. But I want to be careful here in saying that just because we know Jesus didn't say anything, at least recorded in the Gospels, about racial equality, doesn't mean he didn't advocate for it. I think most people who have a general understanding of Jesus' spirit would know that he came for humanity and not one race. So when we look at Muhammad's views on racial equality, we have to go really to the period before he was born. So right before 570, when we look at what type of society Mecca was, we have a very divided society, oftentimes divided on tribal affiliations and differences, which inevitably bring up the issue of ethnicity and race. So essentially, 570, when Muhammad is born in Mecca, how you're born into the world is essentially what you'll end up in the world, right? So if you're born into the world in this racial category, or you're born into a inferior tribe, you have very little luck of being socially mobile and of kind of following your dreams. So Muhammad comes and, arguably, he's trying to wipe this idea out. He's trying to push people to transcend classifications based on how people look. And, Stuart Hall, a really prominent sociologist working in the 80s and 90s, always said that human beings look at the body as it's a text. So you read it. Just as we read a book, we look at a person and we read their race. And then we come up with all sorts of, conclusions and assumptions about that race. Muhammad's idea, given to him by God, Islam, if you want to call that, is coming to kind of bust that up, to break that up. And we have a couple of examples, and the two that I like to use are Muhammad's relationship with Bilal, and then also the farewell sermon. So Muhammad's relationship with Bilal, for those who are not familiar with Bilal, they say he was from, the scholars, early historians say he was from Abyssinia, which is essentially modern day Ethiopia. And we'll get back to we could get back to the Abyssinians at some point. But Bilal had darker skin. He was African. It's also said that he may have been mixed race. He may have had some Arab through his mother. But either way, he was different. He was considered not the racial or tribal norm. And Muhammad became good friends with him. And Muhammad became good friends with him because he knew Bilal had strong character and conduct. He was a man of his word. And ultimately, Muhammad came to love him. And we know through reported stories that some of the other companions used to harass Bilal and kind of condemn him, again, for how he was born into the world. And we have Abu Dhar al-Ghafari literally says, you're the son of a black woman, to Bilal. And when you refer to someone's mother, you're referring to how you're brought into this world. And he's saying, almost like who you are, your race is condemned because of how you look. And Muhammad tells Abu al-Jafari that he's stuck in the age of Jahiliyyah, which for those who are not familiar with that Arabic term, it means the state of ignorance or the pre-Islamic, pre-Muhammad's reception of the revelations. And when we think of Jahiliyyah in light of Muhammad's view on racial equality, we see that racism is part of the state of ignorance. That's literally what Muhammad's saying. He's saying racism, or viewing people not based on character and conduct, but based on their phenotypes and their genes, is ignorant. That's what he's saying. And eventually, Bilal is freed through Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr buys his freedom. Bilal emerges as one of the most symbolic early Muslims in the sense that he serves as the muezzin, the person that calls the Muslims to prayer. So he was a revered figure. So Muhammad defended him, actively defended him. Muhammad wasn't one of these people who just said, that's wrong. Don't do that. Muhammad elevated him in society, gave him opportunity, raised his essence, raised his himself to a prominent position. And that's not non-racism, if you know what I mean, right? That's anti-racism. There's a difference. Anti-racism is when it's a process of taking action to dismantle racial equalities and the consequences that come with racial equalities. Non-racism is simply that. It's just not being racist. Just as we see a need for pluralism over tolerance, we see a need for anti-racism over non-racism. And then the final thing I'll say about racial equality, and I'll quickly go over this, is the farewell sermon, in which, Muhammad One of the final main teachings that he leaves to his community, the Ummah, is an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab. Blacks have no superiority over non-blacks. Whites have no superiority over non-whites, except in piety and good action. And I always like to kind of pause here. I think it's pretty self-explanatory why that passage is powerful. But when we go back to the beginning of this talk, I mentioned, one of my early interests in this field is finding stories that can bridge civilizational gaps. And when we think about an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab except in piety and good conduct, we can fast forward to 1963 with Martin Luther King Jr., an American, an African American, and a Christian, who is literally on the footsteps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. for his I Have a Dream speech, in which he says, I'm paraphrasing, I hope one day my children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And for me, Martin Luther King Jr. is a founding father of this country. Just because he wasn't there at the beginning doesn't mean that he doesn't understand what this country was supposed to be about. And to me, King Jr. and Muhammad can be linked there. I'm not saying that Martin Luther King Jr. is more important than Muhammad, so please don't interpret it that way. All I'm saying is we have an example of different parts of history in different parts of the world, people of different religions basically calling for the same thing. That's beautiful, and I think we need to find more of these stories. The last theme I want to focus on is that of the civic nation versus ethnic nation dichotomy. So the civic nation is a type of nation that is contract oriented. And by that, I mean what makes you part of a community is a contract, a set of rules, principles, let's call it the Constitution, that is able to govern and determine who's part of the nation and who is not. And typically, civic nations have fundamental teachings and principles like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, separation of church and state, and so on and so forth. So ideally, this country, the United States, and many other Western countries, at least at the moment, are ideally civic nations. So anyone could belong to these countries by fact, right? So like pretty much anyone can be an American citizen, but whether they can be an American is a different story. But the civic nation is about citizenship. So you're an American if you have a passport. That's what makes it unique. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have an ethnic nation or a racial nation. And we just referred to Bilal and Muhammad's relationship with him, Muhammad kind of eradicating this idea of ethnocentrism or racial superiority. What we have with an ethnic nation is, again, one that determines one's sense of belonging in one's place in society based on how you're born. So a classic example of a racial or ethnic nation is the Third Reich of Nazi Germany under Hitler. So that wasn't just about the purified white race. There were purified races within white races. Like even me as an Italian and an Irish, I would have been doomed. In Nazi Germany. But that's what an ethnic nation is. It's very tribal, and it's kind of going back to this pure, we're the true humans and where we should be the true conquerors. So when Muhammad goes to Medina in the second Hijra, we know through the sources that he is brought there to essentially be a negotiator, right? He's brought there to be the man in the middle of warring tribes, and he is basically asked to govern, to legislate, and essentially to kind of determine a common ground for the people of Medina. And we're told, I think there was like 10,000 people in Medina at the time, which was pretty sizable then in 615. And Muhammad had to deal with not only generations of warring tribes and their conflicts and their feuds and their blood rivalries, but there was also a sizable Jewish population there, Arab Jews essentially. And Muhammad had to bring them all together, and he said, okay, how the heck are we going to make this work? because there was nothing that diverse that constituted one nation or country in the region. It just wasn't heard of that, people of all different kind of walks of life or tribal backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds could come together and coexist. So in comes the Constitution of Medina. Some scholars say it's the first written constitution in the world, which is probably, that's a fair assessment. I think a lot of people like to say the Magna Carta, but either way, it doesn't matter. We're not trying to play a game of who did it first. All we know is that this Constitution existed. And in short, you can read it yourself. It's readily available online. But some of the fundamental political, philosophical principles that Western civilization is so-called founded on was present in Medina, excuse me, in 615. Things like freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, the right to own private property. And the Constitution is explicit here. It's basically saying, Jews don't have to convert to be part of this community. That's not what we're getting at here. We're essentially creating a confederation, almost like a nation, sovereign nations within, sovereign nations within a larger nation. So kind of like a republic, if you think about it. Like when you think of ancient Rome and you think of the Italian peninsula, you had little republics here and there, little kind of cities that were sovereign in some ways, and they had kind of self-determination, but they were part of a bigger confederation. That's what arguably Muhammad was creating in Medina, which was an unprecedented political project for its time, one that was far ahead of its time, and one, I think, in many ways matches the vision of the founding fathers of this country. So interesting parallels there. And I'm kind of, with these three examples, with pluralism, anti-racism, and civic nation, I'm kind of playing in this space or operating in this space that I like to refer to as the gray zone. So it's the space in between our rigid definitions and understandings of Western civilization and Islamic civilization. This idea that these two entities are separated, not mutually inclusive, not built upon each other, is, I think, kind of fundamentally flawed. If we think that this space of confluence and synthesis where we have communities coming together, traditions coming together, creating something and blending into something new, if you don't think that's an accurate portrayal of history, that's simply just not accurate. So we have the kind of obligation to find these stories in time, and I suppose if I was a pessimist, I could easily focus on some more negative stories, which is unfortunate. Some people do that. Some people make a career off of doing that. But I think we need to have a deeper conversation with ourselves. And that deeper conversation, I think, in many ways relates to humanity. I mean, do we want to be the type of individual person that is only focused on and interested in the stories that divide us? Or do you want to be a person that can serve as a cultural navigator, someone that can understand all of these different moments in history, all of these waves of civilization and the confluence of them? Can we find stories and can we operate in that kind of gray zone, that gray space, to offer people an alternative, offer people these moments in time where things were beautiful and things synthesized? So that's what the book is about. And I know I'm kind of running out of time, but let me also add that there are other chapters of the book and a lot of other stories are told. Like, I would love to get into the first Hijra, the story of the early migration of the believers from Mecca to Abyssinia. Fascinating bit of history. But I also dedicate the biggest chapter of the book to knowledge. And I focus on Muhammad's emphasis and the stress and importance that he laid on knowledge, learning, which is captured in all those themes I just talked about. And I dedicate an entire chapter to different moments in history where Christians and Muslims, but also people of different ethnicities and walks of life, come together and create something new. And I look to Al-Andalus, I look to Sicily, which I call the other Al-Andalus, which is when Arab, Islamic, Christian, Greek, Byzantine empires came together and created something that is not seen or found on any other place of the earth. I compare Rumi and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who, if you're born in the United States, like I was in Boston, where Emerson is from, I highly suggest if you like Rumi, you will love Emerson. And Emerson even quotes Rumi on multiple occasions. So the knowledge chapter is significant. I also dedicate one to women's rights, and I look at how Muhammad was essentially a revolutionary when it came to progressive ideas of a woman's place in society. And I focus on two more chapters. One is the Golden Rule, which is treat others how you want to be treated. And I dive into the Bible and the Quran to kind of justify my positions. And then finally, I kind of tease a little bit by giving some of my own personal insight on Muhammad as the spirit of truth. So if you're familiar with kind of Islamic apologetics and the Bible, you'll note that some scholars of the Bible say that Muhammad was predicted in the Bible. And the passage refers to him as the spirit of truth. So the last chapter, I kind of start talking about how I recognize Muhammad as a prophet. And that's a good place to stop. And it's also a good segue, let me add here, that I've been spending pretty much all my time on another book that is coming out in 2021. And this one is called The Dialogue of Civilizations, Muhammad's Interactions with Christians. It also might be The Dialogue of Civilizations, Muhammad and the Christians of Arabia. I haven't decided yet. But this book is arguably my favorite book that I've ever researched and written. It'll be published by Hearst, which is based in London, and hopefully Oxford. I think they're going to join up, Oxford University. And this is a complex book, but in an accessible way. I'm quite good at kind of breaking it down. At least I hope. So this book serves as a biography of Muhammad's life as told through his interactions with Christians. It's also a book of civilizational clashing, but also of confluence and coalescence. So I kind of develop a theoretical framework of how we can look at these different moments in time when civilizations come to clash. And then also, and most importantly, this book has been a real trip for me as a Christian, because to understand who Muhammad was interacting with in terms of the Christians in his midst, we have to go back into time and we have to figure out how those Christians got there. So we had 600 years of Christian history, almost, 0 to 570 when Muhammad was born. There was so much going on in Christianity over the nature of Jesus. We call it Christology. And essentially one thing I'm finding, and I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to put this, so kind of don't quote me on it, but basically what I'm saying is Muhammad was in many ways sharing a narrative of Christianity that had been deemed heretical a long time ago through various councils of Christian leaders around the world. So I'll leave, last thing, I know I'm getting into like a different ballgame here, but something like the Trinity, right? Like we know that the Quran is critical of the notion of the Trinity. And we also know that he's critical of Jesus's divinity. But if you go back into Christian history, there was not always a consensus on Jesus's divinity or humanity. Jesus was not always the Son of God. He was not always divine. So the book also gives historical insight into all of these different Christian communities and why Muhammad may have been saying what he did about them. So I'm happy to talk about both books, and I'm also happy to talk about anything really, for that matter. So hopefully that was concise. That was about 40 minutes. So
yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
There was so much to take in. This was all very insightful. complex at times, but like you did say, I want to assure you that you did do a very great job of breaking things down to make it understandable to all of our guests who are watching us here today. I'm hoping. So we will just slowly segue into our question and answer session. Now, we did have a couple questions coming through our YouTube live chat, and I'm just going to go ahead and answer them one by one, just make sure we get all questions that our guests have answered. So first question we had is, how would you interpret the violent Muslim groups who claim to follow such a peaceful prophet?
It's really unfortunate to witness that, to witness, people interpreting such a proud and rich faith the way that they do. And I think, most objective and honest scholarly examinations would conclude that Muhammad would always use violence as a last resort. It wasn't this idea of just going around and causing chaos. It was the exact opposite, actually. So when we see people acting in a militant manner, I think the issue is, and may sound kind of arrogant, but I think they're just not educated in the context of the stories that are presented to them in the Quran and the Hadith. So like, if you're not familiar with the political dynamic that developed between the believers in Medina and the Jews of Medina, if you didn't understand what they had agreed to and what eventually happened, if you didn't know that, then you would interpret these verses of the Quran as essentially saying, yeah, the Quran condemns all Jews. It doesn't say that, like Jews are people of the book, but the Quran is also documenting, and the Hadith do as well, they're documenting friction between these two communities. And agreements were broken, but that's just one Jewish group. And I don't think these militant individuals are understanding, why the violence even happened to begin with. And I think they just see it as this kind of totalitarian, like Islam is the best and this is it. And then they just they run over people. And I just don't think that's not what Muhammad was doing. That's not what God was revealing to him either. And then I'll also add that, this militancy extremism is certainly not unique to the Islamic tradition either. And this is kind of one thing I learned a long time ago. If you dig into Christian history, and you look at the militancy and extremism there, it's arguably worse than the Islamic tradition. And I think what's happening is like we're dealing with a very turbulent period where there's waves of these extremisms coming in, and we happen to live in a time where the West has a significant political role to play in Muslim majority lands, and I think people are not happy about it, and awfully, unfortunately, some people are led to extremes and they're led to violence. And, that's really unfortunate. But, these things aren't unique to Muslims. Christian extremism is a whole nother story that we could get into. But one that I tackle in my new book, the Dialogue of Civilizations, when I look at heresies and popes and Byzantine emperors basically saying people are heretical and basically excluding them or killing them. So this is humanity. This is the downside of humanity, unfortunately.
Right. Unfortunately, that is the case. Question 2 is focusing on religion as a whole, I think. And it is, how will the state of religion be in the future? Not only Islamic religion, but all religions. And how will people relate themselves to religion or faith in the coming decades?
That's a good question. I think you can't give one broad sweeping answer for the world. When we look at religion in the world, we have to look at the local contexts in which religion is practiced. So we have to look at nations, regions of the world, communities, so on and so forth. So there are some countries in which religion is not very significant in terms of, the influence that it has in guiding governments or even society. So China, for example, comes into mind, even though, it's a historically Buddhist country and actually historically religiously diverse and rich in its own self. But, we're not really seeing a kind of resurgence of religion. If anything, we may be seeing the opposite of that with, we have the Uyghurs, and we also have the persecution of Christians, which is really unfortunate in China as well. Now, in the United States, because it's so religiously diverse, we have to start breaking it down and looking at specific communities. So I think the Muslim American community, if I could call it that, I think there's multiple communities within one larger community. I think Muslims have been here for a long time, but like the families and this idea of passing down culture through generations is something that most ethnic groups in this country have gone through. So like I know I'm less conservative than my parents. And they're less conservative than their parents, if you know what I mean. And I think America tends to secularize people, but I don't think we should be afraid of that term secularize. And by that, I mean kind of non-religious, like you take religion out of kind of the public sphere. I think America tends to do that to people and religion becomes more private. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think religion could be equally effective if it's not kind of shoved down your throat and if it's not seen everywhere. I think that's fine. In the evangelical community in this country, now that is an area that I think needs a lot more attention from experts. We've seen through polls and studies that relations, especially between evangelicals and Muslims, are not very good in this country. And we know that evangelicals are essentially the largest religious group in this country. So that's a bit concerning as well. But we also have some amazing leaders, Christian and Muslim, or evangelical and Muslim in this country, really working hard to build bridges, which is excellent. Europe, on the other hand, is increasingly secular, more so than us, kind of a bit more hostile to religion, especially in countries like France, where you have things of, banning hijab and various articles of clothing. And, you can't cover up if you work for the government and like things like that. So Europe is maybe post-Christian, if I could say that. I don't think America is there yet. And then the last one I will say is India. India is another kind of hot spot that we're seeing like pretty systematic religious persecution, especially with the Muslim minority. And it seems like it's really coming at an institutional level. And I'm concerned that there's only going to be more conflict between religious groups in that country. So again, when we talk about religion in the world, there's not one kind of solution. There's not one explanation. You really have to consider the local context in which religion is present.
Yeah, I agree. Building off of what you said about the case for the United States regarding, evangelical Christians and Muslims, what is your recommendation to Muslims who are trying to reach out to Christian communities that are not willing to be in dialogue with Muslims?
I'll say this. It takes time. Mm-hmm. If you get rejected via email, one email that you sent, or if you have one lousy experience with one Christian from a certain local community, don't assume that the whole community is like that. Like that is something that a lot of Christians in this country are guilty of with Muslims, right? They're like, oh, this Muslim did that, therefore all Muslims are this way. And we know that's just silly. So, friendships take time. They really do. And there's very few times in my life where I can say, I knew right off the bat that I was going to be friends with that person for a long time. That's a very rare thing. It's a beautiful thing, but it's rare. Friendships take time. They evolve over time. They take a certain amount of effort. They take also a little bit of humbleness allowing yourself to open up, allowing yourself to be vulnerable. These things aren't, letting your guard down isn't a bad thing. But that said, we also need to be careful too and make sure we're not interacting with people who have kind of fringe ideas. So I would say, keep at it, keep kind of pushing people's buttons without being annoying and trying different methods of connecting with people. And I think half the battle is just getting people to the table, getting people to a singular setting. That's really, really important. And I suppose getting people there is the hardest part.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the wonderful advice. Our next question is, how do you see the newest generation of students, so Generation Z, in terms of openness to pluralism? And the individual, our guest who commented, says, my sense is that students are more open now, but I might be in a bubble.
So this is something that's a really good question. Thank you for offering that. So I will say this. This is something that is very kind of real to me because I am passionate about teaching and I also have a ton of students in my classes. I would say that this generation, broadly speaking, not treating it as a monolith, are open to pluralism, but they're afraid of making mistakes. They're afraid of saying something that is culturally insensitive. They're afraid of saying something that may come across as racist. So they're almost, it's like walking on coals, like where people are tiptoeing across a fire and they don't want to upset anyone, which I understand, but you're not going to learn unless you ask the questions or if you communicate with people. So one thing I've noticed in my own self is when I'm willing to make mistakes and I'm willing to kind of be put down and told that I'm wrong, those have been the moments that have really pushed me forward and kind of made me think more critically about how I can be impactful. So I tell students, if you engage in pluralism or allyship or whatever you want to call it, if you engage in it and for some reason you're criticized for something you do or say, and if you get upset about that and you let it get you down, then your ego has got you in its grip. And then it becomes about you. But really, it's not about you, right? Because that's not why you got into it. You're into it because you want to engage with humans. So messing up is part of the process. You have to get yourself out there. You have to learn on the go, and you can't be afraid to make mistakes. That's literally what I tell my students. I say there's a difference between a safe space and a brave space. A safe space is we can all exist in a classroom and no one says anything that could potentially hurt anyone's feelings. If you do that, no one grows, no one learns. But if you live in a brave space, you're willing, to get beat up, not physically, but you're willing to get new ideas and new perspectives, and you're willing to be humbled. So that's my perspective on that.
Thank you. And then finally, our last question is, how do you think Christians and Muslims can benefit from their differences? I know there are a lot of similarities, but even still, how can we turn the differences into opportunities to connect?
Yeah, this is a good question. And Eck, Diana Eck from Harvard says pluralism is not the kind of diffusion where everyone is the same. It's not that. So I would say this, with understanding and recognizing our differences, I would say maybe even something with giving charity. I mean, Christians and Muslims may give charity in different ways. There may be different processes behind the giving of charities. There may be different movements or communities that these two specific communities give to. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, they're giving. And that's charity, that's charitable, and that's important. So what I would like people to see is, can we bring Christian charity and Islamic charity together into the public sphere and do something with that? Kind of have a joint charitable event or movement in which these two kind of parallel charitable systems can just kind of coexist next to each other, right? So I'm kind of playing around with the question. still going back to the common ground, because I'll always go back to the common ground and not necessarily the differences, but like we can bring the differences to the common ground and we can work together in a way that can benefit our communities and also ourselves, so we can be spiritually and personally uplifted and enriched by these experiences.
Yeah, thank you. And excuse me, I'm sorry, I missed one question. I just want to make sure that that's answered for our guests here. But the last one, hopefully, will be, why are the civic countries opting for pluralism if almost no one is allowed to live here?
I'm not sure, allowed to live in the United States?
United States and other modern civic nations.
So pluralism doesn't always necessarily happen at a national level. Pluralism can happen within a neighborhood or a community or an interfaith event. So pluralism can happen there. Pluralism doesn't always happen at a national, governmental, state level, even though this country was arguably founded on a pluralistic mindset. This is the, I suppose, complexity and the confusion of nation states. We can go back into an American history and we can look at the moments of pluralism, and then we can look at the moments of the ethnic nation and the racial nation, right? So these are just theories and themes that we're able to kind of deploy to look at nations. And unfortunately, we're going through a time where the pluralism exists, the civic nation exists, but they're just not in government. Unfortunately, the ethnocentrists, I think in many ways, are the people who are currently governing this country. And we just need to kind of accept it as that. It doesn't mean the United States is not civic oriented or pluralistic. I mean, I'm an American, right? Like I engage in these things, but I'm not involved in the government. But that doesn't mean that pluralism in the civic nation isn't rife throughout the country. Unfortunately, we need to vote in 2020. I'll just say that. In November, actually, a couple of months from now. My months are all messed up because of the coronavirus. That's the second time I've said coronavirus.
Yes, I agree. So essentially what you're saying is we start local and we be the change we want to see.
I wish I had said that. You said it better than I could have. Exactly. And I think local with us, ourselves, you and me individually, like not only our families and our neighborhoods and our communities, it starts literally within us, then our families, then our neighborhoods, and then so on and so forth. I'm definitely a fan of like micro sociology, doing it at the small level rather than hoping and wishing that, government leaders will dictate this change from the top. I don't think that's going to happen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This again, like I said, it was very insightful and amazing. And I know I want to speak on behalf of everyone who's joining us today, say that we're all very excited about your book that's coming out soon and the one for next year also.
Yes.
Are there any last words? I know we had you talking for a while now, but is there anything else that you would like to add?
I'll add one quick thing. When we were talking about the youth and pluralism, and I was mentioning the brave space and the safe space, let me remind viewers that fear can be a gift or a curse. Fear can mean forget everything and run, which means you're fearful and you run away from your fear. Fear could mean false evidence appearing real, which is, you've kind of been brainwashed into being fearful of something. But the fear that I like to kind of conceptualize, and this is where it becomes a gift, is face everything and rise. So if you're fearful, you've got to find a way of not backing down from it and grappling with it, because that's really how you grow. So for those out there kind of concerned about getting involved, you just got to do it and you got to transcend the fear.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for joining us. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in on our conversation. And we hope to see you all at a future event.
Thank you so much, Fitna. You did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.